The entire city's emergency network was screaming the same 3 words: S-rank gate breach, and every one of them was wrong. It wasn't an S rank. It wasn't close. The thing that tore out of the gate behind me was a doorman, a low-floor nothing, the kind of creature that had killed me maybe 400 times back when I was still soft, and it had just dropped a national strike team in 4 seconds flat. I killed it with one hand without finishing my turn to look at it. That was the exact moment the 3 strongest people on Earth changed course and started flying toward a containment yard at the edge of the city, because every one of them had just felt something step out of a gate that wasn't supposed to open. They were coming to see a monster. They were going to find a man who had been dead for 3 years, and they were not going to know what to do about it. To understand how I ended up there. One punch, a dead thing steaming at my feet, a dozen hunters too frightened to pull their triggers. You only need one number. Not the S rank, their alarms were shrieking. Mine, 10,306. That is how many times I died before I walked back out my own front door. To the men aiming their weapons at me, I had been gone 3 years, a corpse, a closed file, a funeral already paid out of a modest government fund. To me, it had been 1,000 years, because time runs 1,000-fold inside the thing that took me, and the thing that took me has a name this world has spent 15 years too small to imagine. The tower. Here is what nobody left alive understands about it, because exactly one person has ever come back down to explain, and it is currently me. It is not a dungeon. A dungeon is a room you clear and leave. The tower is a sentence, and its cruelty is pure arithmetic. An afternoon out here is a year in there. A long weekend is a lifetime. I was 20 years old with a little sister to get home to, and by the time I understood what the acceleration meant, I had already been climbing 6 months, and 12 minutes had passed in the world where she was waiting. So I climbed faster. That is the whole story of the first few centuries. A boy trying to get home before dark, learning that the only way out of the tower is up, through 10,000 floors of things built to end him, and that dying just resets you to the start of the floor with the wound remembered. And here is the part that made me. Every death the tower took, it kept. Each time it killed me, it rebuilt me a hair stronger. A hair harder to finish, because the only climber the tower respects is a corpse that refuses to stay down. 10,000 deaths is 10,000 forgings. Do that for 1,000 years, and you stop being the boy who fell through a gate. You become the thing the tower was built to make. And then the top opens, and it lets that thing out. I need to tell you about the middle, though, because the middle is where men are lost, and I came very close to being one of them. There is a stretch of the climb. I put it somewhere around year 400. Though, by then my sense of time was a joke I'd stopped telling, where a person simply forgets that he was ever a person. You have died so many times that death stops meaning anything. You have killed so many things that killing stops costing anything. The tower is very patient and very quiet, and what it wants, in the end, is not for you to fail. It wants you to succeed so completely that there is nothing human left in the thing that reaches the top, a weapon with no reason to put itself down. That is the true final floor, and it isn't made of stone. I know exactly what pulled me back, because it was the same thing every time, for 1,000 years. A face. Small, stubborn, gap-toothed at the front where she'd lost a tooth to a curb when she was 9. And I'd carried her home on my back, telling her the tooth fairy paid extra for brave ones. Nora. Our parents were gone by the time she was 10, and I was 15. And I had raised her on cheap noodles and worse jokes, and the iron, unspoken promise that whatever else the world took, it would not take her, because I would always come home. Then a gate opened behind a corner store while I was walking her to school, and it reached for her, and I did the only arithmetic that has ever mattered to me. I put myself between. The tower took me instead. The last thing I saw before the door closed was her face, 15 years old, screaming a name, my name. And the last thing I decided, before 1,000 years of stone and dying, was that I was going to walk back through that door and finish taking her to school. if it was the final thing this body ever did. So every time the tower offered me the quiet, the sweet, total forgetting, the weapon with no reason, I carved another mark on the wall, and I said her name out loud into the dark, and the dark had no answer for it. You cannot forge a man past the reason he climbs. The tower learned that from me the way I learned everything from it. Slowly, and at enormous cost. It made me into the strongest thing it had ever produced. And it never once managed to make me stop being her brother. That was the only fight in 1,000 years I won cleanly. On an ordinary gray afternoon, the door at the peak of the world opened onto the bottom of it, and I walked out of the tower and back onto the earth I had left, into a planet that had spent 15 years learning to call itself strong and had never once met the real thing. The gate spat me out into a containment yard. That is what it had become in the 3 years and change I was gone. When the anomalous gate took me, it had been a raw tear in the air behind a corner store. Now it stood ringed in concrete and floodlights and a chain-link perimeter, plastered with hazard placards, a dormant anomaly designation stenciled on every surface, and a full Hunter Association strike team dug in behind sandbags with their weapons and their glowing skills already trained on the exit. Because after 3 years of a gate that never opened and never closed, the one thing the manuals agreed on was that when a dead gate finally moves, whatever comes out is not a survivor. Contact. We have contact. Something's coming through. I stepped out into the floodlights, and a dozen awakened hunters looked at the thing that emerged from a gate no one had ever exited alive, and did exactly what their training told them. Hands. Hands where I can see them. On your knees. I looked at them. It had been a very long time since I had seen this many people who were not trying to eat me, and some old buried part of me wanted to laugh or weep or sit down in the concrete and shake. I didn't. 1,000 years teaches you to keep your face still while you take a measure of the room, and out of pure habit, older than habit now, the appraisal opened behind my eyes and read them for me the way it had read every threat I'd faced since floor 1. Strike team leader. Awakened. Combat rating, B. Threat assessment, negligible. The interface still worked out here. Good. But the number it gave me, I read it twice, the way you reread a word that has stopped making sense. B rank. The man leading this team, the strongest person in the yard by their own posture, sat at a threat level the tower would have logged somewhere around floor 3. I had spent longer than his entire civilization had existed climbing past floor 3. I had died on floor 3 more times than he had drawn his weapon in his life. He's not registering. A second hunter, a woman with a scanner, her voice climbing. Sir, the badge reader, it's not reading him at all. No rank. No signature. He's not in the system. Then he's a monster in a man's skin. Weapons hot. I'm not a monster, I said. My own voice surprised me. Rough, unused, older than the body it came out of. My name is Kane Mercer. I was pulled into this gate 3 years ago. I'd like to go home now. The name landed on nothing. Of course it did. A 20-year-old nobody who fell into a gate 3 years back was a closed case, a line in a ledger, a death benefit paid to a next of kin. Kane Mercer was a corpse with the paperwork already filed, and corpses do not walk out of dead gates and ask directions. Kane Mercer's deceased, the leader. Reeve, his patch said. Marcus Reeve spat. Whatever you are, you've got about 3 seconds to explain why my scanner thinks you're a hole in the world before I put you back in the one you crawled out of. And then the gate behind me answered the question for both of us, because the tower is never done with you, and it does not like loose ends. The floodlights guttered. The dormant gate, 3 years quiet, cracked open a second time, not for me this time, and the pressure that rolled out of it put every hunter in that yard on their back foot at once. I knew that pressure. I had spent 1,000 years learning its grammar. Something was coming through behind me, something the tower had let follow me down like a hook set in a fish, and it was, by the standards of the place I'd come from, nothing. a gatekeeper, a low-floor guardian, the kind of thing that had killed me, perhaps 400 times when I was still soft. By the standards of the yard, it was the end of the world. It came out fast, 9 feet of chitin, and too many joints, moving faster than a thing that size had any business moving, and it went through the strike team the way weather goes through a tent. Not cruelty, just tonnage. A hunter I'd been threatening to surrender to a moment ago was suddenly airborne, and Reeve was screaming rank designations into a radio. West, skate, we need, S-rank response, and the woman with the scanner had frozen the way people freeze when the number in front of them is larger than their capacity to believe it. I was tired. I want that on the record before the rest of it. Not physically. I had not been physically tired in about 6 centuries, but tired in the way you are tired when you have finally gotten home, and the first thing home asks of you is the exact thing you spent 1,000 years doing and hoped never to do again. I did it anyway. You always do it anyway. That is the last thing the tower teaches you, and the only lesson worth the climb. I stepped between the guardian and the hunter. It was about to fold in half, and I caught the descending limb the way you catch a door. Flat palm, no drama, and the whole yard went silent except for the sound of a thing that had killed me 400 times, discovering, all at once, that it could not move. On the tower, I told it quietly, in a language it happened to understand, and the humans didn't. You were a doorman. Then, I put my fist through it once, and the low-floor guardian that had triggered a national S-rank emergency came apart across the containment yard, like a piñata full of the dark, and the echo of the blow rolled off the concrete and the floodlights and the open mouths of a dozen awakened hunters who had just watched an unrankable dead man kill an S-threat with his hands. Before their reinforcements had finished dialing. Silence. The particular silence of people rebuilding their model of the world in real time. I flexed my hand. It ached a little. The muscle memory of 400 deaths says a guardian should hurt more than that, and the body remembers what the mind has forgiven. I turned back to Marcus Reeve, B rank, threat negligible, who was staring at me with his weapon still half raised and every certainty he owned draining out of his face. I've been gone 3 years, I said. I had a sister, Nora Mercer. She'd be about 18 now. My voice did the thing I couldn't stop it doing on her name, the one crack 1,000 years hadn't sealed. I climbed a very long way to ask you where she is. So I'm going to ask nicely once. Reeves' radio was still going in his hand, a tinny voice asking for a status, asking what the S-rank threat was, asking him to report. He looked at me, and he looked at the thing I'd killed, and he lowered the radio, and I watched a small, career-ending honesty arrive behind his eyes. I don't have clearance to answer that, he said. But the people who do are already on their way here. Fast. Everybody who matters just felt what you did. He swallowed. Mr. Mercer, what are you? It was a good question. I'd had 1,000 years to think about it, and standing in that yard, in the floodlights, on the earth I'd bled a millennium to get back to, I still only had the one answer, and it wasn't the one he wanted. Late, I said. I'm late. And above the city, from 3 separate directions, I heard the sound of the strongest people on Earth flying toward a containment yard to see the corpse that walked out of the tower. And somewhere under all of it, so faint that only a man who'd listened to it for 1,000 years could have caught it, I heard the gate behind me settle and breathe and begin, very patiently, to grow. They didn't arrest me. You can't arrest a man you're too frightened to touch. What they did was invite me, very politely with 40 guns, into the back of an armored transport, and then into the deepest reinforced room the Hunter Association owned, and call it processing. I let them. That is the part none of them could get their heads around in those first hours that I was choosing it. I had spent 1,000 years unable to choose anything. The tower picks your floors for you. Walking where I wanted, sitting when I wanted, letting small, nervous people believe their handcuffs meant something. That was a luxury so enormous I could have wept. So I sat in their reinforced room with its mirrored wall and its bolted chair, and I folded my hands and I waited, because the one thing I needed was in this building somewhere, an answer. The waiting was harder than any floor I ever climbed, and not for the reason you'd think. It was the softness. 1,000 years in a place designed to kill you rewires a man. My body had spent the whole ride to the association reading every surface for threats, and finding, impossibly, none. Chairs that were only chairs. A ceiling that would not open and drop something on me. Air that didn't taste of iron and rot. A young technician came in to draw my blood, and his hands were shaking so hard he missed the vein twice, and I had to fight down 1,000 years of instinct that read a needle coming at my arm as an attack. And I sat there and let a frightened boy stab me 3 times, because being not used in 10 centuries, and I found, to my surprise, that I had missed it. Right? That I had missed it more than sunlight. The needle bent. My blood wouldn't come out. He looked at the crumpled steel in his hand, like it had personally betrayed him, and behind the mirror I heard someone swear. That was the pattern of the next hour. Every instrument they brought either read nothing or died trying. A mana scanner that overloaded and popped. A rank gauge whose needle spun once and snapped off. A containment ward, etched into the floor, that flickered and went dark the moment I stepped over it, as if the room itself had looked at me and quietly decided not to make any promises it couldn't keep. The 3 who'd flown to the yard came to look at me through the glass. I felt them arrive the way you feel weather change. By modern standards, they were gods. The nation's only 3 S ranks, the ceiling of human power. The appraisal read them for me anyway, dry and merciless behind my eyes. Rank 3. Combat rating, S. Threat, minor. A sharp-faced young man in a tailored coat, all edges, who looked at me like a stain on his morning. Rank 2. Combat rating, S. Threat, minor. Rank 1. Combat rating S+. Threat, low. And this one made me look up, because low was the highest number the interface had shown me on this side of the gate. A woman, maybe 22, standing very still, reading me the way I was reading her. She had the stillness I recognized. Not the stillness of the calm, but of the dangerous. On the tower, she'd have made it to floor 3, maybe 4 before it took her. Here, she held up the sky. Later, I'd learn her name was Sloane Vega. They called her the Spear. That she'd carried humanity's worst gates on her back since she was 19, and had never once met something she couldn't kill. Right then, she was just the only person in the building looking at me like a question instead of a threat. "You're not reading on anything," she said, through the intercom. Not accusing. Cataloging. Every instrument we own says you're either an F-rank clerical error or a hole in reality. You caught a gate guardian's strike and killed it barehanded, which is an S-rank feat, and your body signature is flatter than a sleeping child's. Explain that. I can't, I said, in a way you'd believe. And I'm not going to try, because we don't have time, and because there's only one thing I want from this building. I looked past her, at the mirror, at whoever stood behind it, holding the real authority. Nora Mercer. My sister. She was 15 when I was taken. Tell me where she is, and I will answer every question you have. Lie to me about her, and I walk out of this room, and none of you can stop me. I'm not threatening you. I'm doing you the courtesy of being honest about the arithmetic. The man who came through the door a minute later was the arithmetic I hadn't accounted for. Director Halloran ran the association's regional bureau, and I understood him in about 4 seconds, because the tower is full of men like him wearing the skins of monsters. He smiled like a door, opening onto a room you don't want to enter. He had a folder. He set it on the table with the tenderness of a man laying down a winning card. Mr. Mercer, or the entity currently using that identity, will sort the metaphysics later. He sat. What a gift you are. Do you understand what you did in that yard? You solved a gate-class threat with your hands. Do you know what the association could do with an asset like that? What I could do. There it was, in the first minute, could do with not thank you. The exact grammar of every man who has ever looked at a strong thing and seen a tool. Your sister. Yes. She's alive. She's registered. He opened the folder just enough to show me the corner of a photograph and closed it again. And her situation is complicated. The good news is complications are my specialty. Cooperate, and I can make her life very easy. Refuse, and afraid I can only process you as an unregistered anomaly, which is, regrettably, an open-ended detention. He thought he was showing me a lever. He was showing me my sister's face, aged 3 years, in a hunter's registration photo, and I stopped hearing anything else in the room, because Nora had awakened. My little sister, the one I'd thrown myself into a gate to keep out of that world, was in it, registered, ranked, a hunter. The debt had done it. I'd learn soon enough. When a household's earner is declared dead in a gate, the survivor's benefit is a loan, not a gift, and the government claws it back with interest, and a 17-year-old girl with no rank and a dead brother had exactly one legal way to out-earn that kind of debt. She'd walked into the same world that ate me, on purpose, to pay for the funeral they'd held for a body that was, at that moment, 400 floors up, refusing to die. I made them tell me the whole shape of it, later, and it was uglier than any monster the tower ever showed me. Because monsters at least don't pretend to be helping. When a household's earner dies in a gate, the state pays the survivor a stabilization benefit, $40,000 for a funeral, a year of rent, a start. What the pamphlets bury in the fine print is that it's a secured advance, not a gift, repayable with interest the moment the survivor comes of age, and the only collateral a poor orphan can put against it is future gate clearance income. It is, in plain words, a machine for turning dead hunters' little sisters into new hunters. Nora had turned 18, inherited a debt that had quietly doubled while she wasn't looking, and been offered exactly one honest way to pay it: awaken, register, and walk into the low gates for clearance bounties, 40 of which might, if she survived them all, clear what the state was owed for burying a brother who wasn't dead. She'd taken an E-rank certification and a rookie roster and started paying my funeral off with her body, one C-class gate at a time. The association called it opportunity. I had 1,000 years of vocabulary for what it actually was, and none of the words were polite. "Where is she right now?" I said. It did not come out as a question. Halloran's smile faltered, because a man who deals in leverage can always tell the instant his lever turns into a blade in someone else's hand. "Mr. Mercer, let's discuss terms before. Right now." It was Sloane who answered, over the intercom, flat and fast, and I think she did it because she'd already read the room better than Halloran ever would. E-rank clearance team, low-threat gate, industrial district. Rookie roster. A pause, and something in her voice shifted the first crack in the ceiling of the sky. The gate destabilized 20 minutes ago. It's been upgraded to C-class mid-clearance. Standard procedure is to seal it with the team still inside and wait for the surge to pass. "Seal it," I repeated, "with the team inside." "It's protocol," Halloran said. "Acceptable losses on a rookie run are." I stood up. The bolted chair came out of the floor when my knee brushed it. Not because I meant it to, just because 1,000 years had recalibrated what gently meant, and the sound of 4 anchor bolts shearing at once did more to explain me to that room than any instrument had. Halloran stopped talking. Sloane, behind her glass, went very still in a new way. "Here are my terms," I said. "I'm going to that gate. You can open the door for me, or I can open it for myself, and one of those options leaves your building intact." I looked at the folder with my sister's face in it. I climbed for 1,000 years to walk her to school. I am not going to be 20 minutes late because a man in a nice coat wanted to discuss acceptable losses. Nobody sealed anything. Sloane Vega met me at the motor pool without being asked, already in her gear, the humanity's strongest set of her jaw telling me she was coming, whether I liked it or not. To supervise the anomaly, she'd say later, though we both knew. Even then it was because some part of her needed to see what I was before she decided what to do about me. The industrial gate's 40 minutes out, she said, swinging into the driver's seat. She drove like the spear she was. Fast, precise, no wasted motion, and she talked the same way, throwing questions at me sideways while the city tore past. You knew the Guardian's floor, she said. You called it a doorman. You keep saying the tower like it's a place, not a rank, a beat. There's no tower in any gate registry on Earth. 15 years of data, every anomaly cataloged. Yours isn't in it, because nothing that goes in it comes back to file the paperwork, I said. I'm the exception. I don't recommend the method. She was quiet a moment, taking a corner hard enough to put us up on 2 wheels and setting us down like she'd planned it. The 3 of us hold the ceiling, she said. Me, and 2 men who each need a full team and a day's notice to close an A gate without dying. That's the top of the human world. And you snapped a containment chair with your knee and made a warding array give up. Her eyes flicked to me, once, reading. So either you're the most dangerous thing that's ever stood on this side of a gate, or you're the only one who's ever come back from the deep end, and we've been drowning in the shallows for 15 years without knowing there was a deep end. I haven't decided which scares me more. Both are true, I said. That's usually how it goes. For the first time, the ceiling of the human world almost smiled. Then dispatch crackled. The industrial gate's threat class had ticked up again, C to B, mid-clearance, rookie team still inside. And whatever she'd almost said turned to iron in her jaw, and she drove faster. I looked at the city blurring past. 15 years changed, taller, brighter, soft in a way that made my chest ache and my teeth set. Somewhere in it, a girl with my mother's stubborn chin was standing in a collapsing gate, believing her brother was 3 years dead. Then drive like the sky's already falling, I said. For her it is. The industrial gate had been a loading yard once. Now it was a cordon, floodlights, barricades, 2 support teams, and a shimmering vertical wound in the air the color of a bruise, pulsing wider, with each beat like something breathing in its sleep. A B-class threat and climbing. I could feel it from the car, a cheap, thin, low-floor pressure, the kind of thing that would have been a Tuesday to me and was, to the people here, a mass casualty event with a name and a case number. And they were already rigging it to seal. A technician was walking a chain of ward anchors around the gate's mouth, the same array that would collapse the aperture and cut off everything inside. Everything and everyone. A field officer with a clipboard was saying the words I'd heard Halloran rehearse. Containment first, retrieval if feasible, rookie roster, acceptable. 6 names on that roster. One of them, when Sloan held up the tablet without a word and let me read it, was Mercer, N. They've got 9 minutes on the seal timer. Sloan said, already out of the car, already reaching for the authority that came with being the strongest person present. I can override it. It'll take me 2 of those minutes to argue down a bureau officer who outranks me on paper. Don't argue, I said, and started walking toward the bruise in the air, and the pressure that had emptied a city block parted around me like it recognized an old landlord. Just keep them from sealing it behind me. Behind you? Nobody's cleared to solo a B-gate mid-surge. I'm not going to clear it, I said. I'm going to go get my sister. The gate's just in the way. And I stepped through the wound in the world, back into the only kind of place I understood, to go collect the last thing worth 1,000 years. Inside, the gate had made itself a cathedral out of a dead factory. Girders fused into ribs, conveyor lines hanging like intestines. Everything wet and breathing and lit the wrong color. Monsters moved in the dark between the machines, dozens of them, and the appraisal painted them all the same flat shade as I passed. Floor 1 fauna. Threat, none. Threat, none. Threat, none. I didn't fight them. There was no point. Fighting them would be like a grown man swinging at a room full of moths, and I had somewhere to be. I walked, and the ones that lunged I moved around, and the ones that got a hand on me learned the same lesson the Guardian had, quietly, without my breaking stride. 1,000 years teaches you the difference between combat and travel. This was travel. It was strange, though, and I let myself feel the strangeness because there was no danger in it to crowd the feeling out. This whole gate, the thing that had emptied a city block, upgraded twice, gotten 6 children written into an acceptable losses column, this was a shallow, a puddle. On the true floors, the ones past the 4,000th, the air itself had weight. The monsters didn't lunge. They calculated. A mistake didn't cost you a wound. It cost you a century of progress and a death you'd remember on every floor after. I had learned to walk into rooms where the correct emotion was terror, and to keep my hands steady anyway. Here, the correct emotion was pity. A pack of the plated things boiled out of a collapsed stairwell and swarmed me all at once, a dozen, them. Jaws and hooks, and I kept walking and let them break themselves on a body that 10,000 deaths had made, and it felt less like a fight than like wading through surf. Somewhere ahead, a girl was giving orders she didn't believe in, and every wasted second between me and that voice was the only thing in the gate that could hurt me. I followed the sound. Under the wet clicking of the swarm, there was a human voice, young, hoarse, giving orders it didn't believe in, and I came around a wall of dead machinery and found the rookie team where the gate had cornered them, backed into a maintenance bay, 3 of them down and bleeding, 1 praying, and 2 still standing between the wounded and the thing the surge had grown. The boss was a B-class by their scale. A bulk of plated muscle and hooking arms, the apex the unstable gate had been feeding, and it had them. It would have had them in another 30 seconds. The whole reason the sealing team upstairs had written 6 names into the acceptable column was standing over those kids with its arms up. And the last one on her feet, out of mana, I could see it, her weapon light guttering, a cheap E-rank barrier flickering over a fallen teammate on nothing but will, was my sister. Nora had my mother's chin. She'd had it at 15, and she had it now at 18, set in exactly the same stubborn line, the line that said I am not moving, even when every sane part of her knew she should. She was taller. Her hair was cut short and practical. There was a scar on her jaw I hadn't been there for, and a hunter's exhaustion on her that no 18-year-old should own. And she was standing her ground in front of a monster 3 ranks above her because the boy beside her couldn't stand his. And in that instant, 1,000 years arranged themselves into a single unbearable point. I had made it. Late, bleeding the wrong color, wearing a body she wouldn't know, but I had made it, and she was alive. And she was still exactly who I'd carved her face into the dark to remember. The boss brought its arm down. I caught it. Same as the Guardian, same as 10,000 things before it. Flat hand, no drama, the maintenance bay ringing with the sound of a B-class threat meeting, something that considered it furniture. The kids' heads snapped up. And my sister, out of mana, out of hope, looked at the enormous scarred stranger who'd appeared out of the dark, holding back the thing that was about to kill her, and did the bravest and most Nora thing imaginable. She got her guttering weapon up and put herself between me and the wounded, too, because she didn't know what I was either. "Get back," she rasped. "I don't. Whatever you are, get back from them." "Nora." My voice broke on it the way it had in the yard, the one crack 1,000 years never sealed. "It's me." "Don't." Her arms were shaking. "My brother's dead. Don't you dare wear his. You lost your front tooth on the Kessler Street curb when you were 9. I said, "And I carried you home on my back and told you the tooth fairy paid extra for brave girls. You made me check under the pillow 4 times. The boss was still straining against my hand. I wasn't looking at it. You were 15. There was a gate behind the corner store. I pushed you clear. I have spent a very, very long time getting back to finish walking you to school." The weapon light went out of her hand and clattered on the concrete. I didn't get to hold her yet. The boss objected, pulled back, reared, came again with everything the surge had built it, and I finally turned and gave it the fraction of attention it had earned. I let go of the arm I'd been holding, stepped in past its guard the way 1,000 years had made reflex, and hit it once in the center of its plated mass, with maybe 1/100th of what the blow could have carried, because the maintenance bay had children in it, and a full strike would have brought the ceiling down on all of us. One strike pulled careful. The same fist that had opened the doorman in the yard, and the B-class apex that a national protocol had been willing to bury 6 children to contain came apart against the far wall and stopped being a threat class and started being weather stains. The maintenance bay went utterly silent. 6 rookies who had, 90 seconds ago, been writing their own eulogies, stared at the wet ruin, sliding down the wall, then at the enormous scarred man standing where their deaths had been, and I watched the same thought move across all their faces at once, the one every survivor of that yard would carry the rest of their lives, that the monster in the room had never been the thing in the gate. The boy Nora had shielded made a small sound, half sob, half laugh, and started shaking. The one who'd been praying kept praying, but changed who to. And I flexed my hand and felt the faint ache that said even a pulled blow at 100th strength had been 3 ranks more than this place could hold, and understood, standing in the wreckage, exactly how careful I was going to have to be, with a whole world made of glass. The gate shuddered. With its apex dead, the surge had nothing to feed, and the aperture behind me, I felt it through the floor. Began, grudgingly, to stabilize. No seal needed. No acceptable losses. Then my sister hit me at a dead run and wrapped both arms around a chest she couldn't reach halfway around, and said my name into my ribs like a word she'd been forbidden to use. And for the first time in 1,000 years, I put my arms around something I loved, instead of something I had to kill, because 1,000 years had made my careful into other men's crushing, and I would sooner have gone up the tower and have gone back up the tower than leave a bruise on her. "You're huge," she sobbed, furious and laughing at once, hitting my arm with a fist that had nothing behind it. "You're where 3 years, they gave us 40,000 and a folded flag and told me you were pasted on a gate wall. I paid for your funeral. I'm still paying for your funeral." "I know," I said into her hair. "I know. I'm here. The debt's over. All of it's over." I got them out, all 6, the wounded slung over my shoulders like grain sacks. Nora refusing to leave my side, the rookie boy she'd shielded, staring at me the whole way like I was a religion he was reconsidering. And we stepped back out through the wound in the world, into the floodlights, and the cordon, and the SEAL team, frozen, mid-protocol, and into the flat, total silence of every professional in that yard recalculating reality for the second time that day. A solo. A B-gate, mid-surge, walked in and walked out, with the entire acceptable losses roster breathing behind me. Sloan Vega stood at the barricade with the SEAL override still in her hand, unused. She looked at the 6 living rookies. She looked at the stabilizing gate. She looked at me, and I watched the ceiling of the human world revise itself downward, and something else move in behind it that I was too tired to name yet. The yard didn't cheer. It didn't know how. Cheering is for a victory you understand, and nobody there understood this one. The SEAL team stood frozen around their unfired array, their whole grim protocol turned into a thing they'd have to explain in a report nobody would believe. A field medic ran for my wounded and then stopped short of me the way you stop short of a live wire. One of the rookies, the boy Nora had shielded, kept trying to salute me and forgetting how halfway through. Behind the barricade, a woman broke from the family cordon screaming a name, and one of the kids I'd carried out lifted his head off the stretcher and screamed, "Mom back." And that at least, I understood. That was worth more than 1,000 years, and it cost me nothing but a walk through a puddle. Halloran arrived while the medics were still working. I watched his face do the whole journey in about 4 seconds, the flash of institutional panic at a soloed B-gate, then the recalculation, then the thing I'd already seen in the interrogation room, worse now because it had data. The slow, greedy dawning of a man realizing the asset was even bigger than he'd priced it. He didn't ask if the rookies were all right. He got on his phone and started, quietly, urgently, making calls about me, cataloging his new inventory. And off to the side, stepping out of a black association car that had followed us, a sharp-faced young man in a tailored coat took in the scene with the particular fury of a man who has spent his whole life being the strongest person in every room, and has just been informed, without a word, that he never was. Rank 3. Dorian Vex. The appraisal gave me his number, and I didn't even bother to keep it. He was going to be a problem. They always are. The ones who mistake their rank for their worth. But that was tomorrow's arithmetic. Tonight my sister was alive, and the funeral was over. And Sloane, without a word to Halloran, which I'd come to learn, was its own kind of statement, drove the two of us away from the cordon herself before the director could invent a reason to keep me. Nora sat pressed against my side in the back seat the whole way, one hand fisted in my sleeve, like she'd let go of me once and wasn't going to survive doing it twice. She'd stopped crying. Now she was just talking, fast and disbelieving. The way you talk to prove the person is really there. You don't age right, she accused. 3 years. You look like you're 40 and 20 at the same time, and you've got gray at the temples and scars, so many scars, and you're the size of a door. What happened in there? Where were you? Was it the whole 3 years, was it? Longer, I said. For me, it was longer, Nora. A lot longer. I didn't have the words for 1,000 years. Not yet, not for her, so I gave her the only true thing that would fit in the car. Every single day of it, I was climbing back to you. That's all it was. The whole time. A very long way home. She was quiet a moment. Then, in a small voice that was 15 again, I kept your room. I couldn't pay the funeral loan and keep the apartment both, so I moved us somewhere smaller. But I kept your stuff. Everyone said I was stupid. Her jaw did our mother's line. I told them the tooth fairy pays extra for brave ones. I didn't even know why I kept saying it. I couldn't file you as gone. 1,000 years. 10,000 deaths. And the thing that finally cracked me open, after all of it, was a girl telling me she'd kept my room. I put my arm around her, and I looked out at the city lights I'd carved into my memory floor by floor, and I let myself, for exactly the length of that drive, not be the strongest thing on earth. Just a brother. Late but home. The debt's over, I told her again, because she needed to hear it more than once. You're done paying for a funeral that shouldn't have happened. You're done walking into gates. I'll handle the gates now. She snorted, wet and defiant, wiping her eyes. You think I clawed my way to a rookie license just to sit home while my giant undead brother has all the fun? I'm still a hunter, Kane. We'll argue about it, I said, which is what our father used to say when he meant no and knew he'd lose. And she laughed, really laughed, and for the length of one drive home, the arithmetic could wait. The world does not have a category for a man who solos a B-gate barehanded, so it spent the next 3 days trying to build one, badly, in public. The footage got out. Cordon footage always does, and by the second morning, I was 6 different things depending on which feed you believed. A hoax, a foreign super soldier, a monster wearing a dead man's face, a miracle. The association said nothing official, which is the loudest thing an institution can say. And behind the silence, Director Halloran worked the phones like a man, building a fence around a gold mine before the neighbors noticed the glint. I spent those 3 days somewhere I hadn't been in 1,000 years, home, or the closest thing left of it. The cramped 2-room walk-up Nora had moved us to when the funeral loan ate the old apartment. She'd kept my things in a cardboard box under her bed because there was no room for a dead man's furniture. And she pulled it out that first night and made me go through it. Fierce about it, like proving the box was real would prove I was. Domesticity, it turns out, is harder to relearn than combat. I took a door off its hinges the first morning simply by opening it at what 1,000 years had taught me was normal speed. I crushed a coffee mug into powder, reaching for it, half asleep, and stood there holding a handle and dust, while Nora laughed so hard she had to sit down on the floor. I cooked the cheap noodles our father used to make, the one recipe my hands remembered from before the tower, and she cried into the bowl and called me an idiot and had seconds. It was, measured against 1,000 years of stone, the best 3 days of my existence, and I spent every one of them quietly aware that a world this soft was a world with a great deal to lose. "I'm not quitting," she said, the second night, before I'd even raised it. She had my mother's chin out. "I know that's the whole speech you're winding up to give." "Don't." I clawed a license out of a system that wanted to bury me with you. It's mine. And now that the whole country knows I'm the climber's little sister, quitting just makes me a hostage with free time. She pointed her chopsticks at me. You of all people don't get to lecture anybody about walking into danger for family. She was right, which is the most annoying thing a little sister can be. And worse, she'd seen the real risk before I'd said it. The sister of the strongest thing on earth was not a safe person to be. I'd made her a target simply by surviving. I filed that fear next to all the others and said nothing, and she knew I'd heard her, and that was the whole argument, won and lost by both of us at once. He called me in on the third day. Not to a cell this time, to an office with a view and good coffee I didn't drink, because a man like Halloran changes the room to match what he's decided you're worth, and I had apparently graduated from anomaly to acquisition. I'll be direct, Mr. Mercer, because I respect what you are. He slid a folder across the desk, a different folder, thicker, with my name on a contract instead of a case file. Special Executive Hunter. A classification we'll invent this week, specifically for you. Unlimited operational budget. A rank designation above S. And the smile, the door opening onto the room. Your sister's stabilization debt marked paid in full. Her license upgraded. Her name off every dangerous roster in the country. All of it. Today. In exchange for a very reasonable thing. You work gates for the association. Exclusively. You go where we send you. You are, on paper and in practice, ours. There it was again. The lever wearing a gift's clothing. Erase the debt I already intended to erase. Protect the sister I already intended to protect. But route it all through him, so that every good thing in Nora's life came stamped with his signature, and could, someday, be unstamped. You're offering me things I'm going to take anyway, I said, and pretending they're a leash. His smile held, but it cooled. Everything's a leash, Mr. Mercer. The only question in any relationship is who's holding it. I'd rather it be a friendly hand than the alternative. You're currently an unregistered, unrankable entity operating on association soil. That's a paperwork problem I can solve with a pen, or one I can let become your entire life. Your sister's license exists at my discretion. Her clean record exists at my discretion. He spread his hands. Reasonable. Reasonable. I'm not threatening. I'm describing the weather. 1,000 years teaches you to recognize the exact moment a place stops pretending. I'd heard this speech before, from things with more teeth and less cologne. Here's my weather, I said, and I didn't raise my voice, because the quiet thing is always the more frightening thing. My sister's debt gets cleared because it was a crime dressed as a loan, not because you were generous. I'll register. I'm not interested in hiding, but I answer to no one's pointing finger, yours least of all. And the next time you use Nora as a comma in a sentence about leverage, I'm going to walk you out to the nearest gate and let you negotiate with the weather in there. I stood. The good chair stayed intact this time. I'd been practicing. You keep looking at me and seeing an asset. Everyone in your position makes that mistake. I'm not the asset, Director. I'm the audit. And I've read your books already. I hadn't, not yet. But he didn't know that. And the flicker behind his eyes told me the books were worth reading. Dorian Vex made his move the same afternoon, which told me the two things were connected before I had any proof of it. He did it in public, at the association's quarterly rank certification, a televised gala where the nation's hunters are ranked and celebrated, all the elite in one gilded hall, exactly the audience a proud man chooses when he needs to reset a story that's gotten away from him. I'd been invited, which meant Halloran wanted me displayed. Dorian wanted me destroyed. Between them, they'd built the perfect stage, and neither had asked the stage what it thought. "The solo," Dorian said loud, cutting across the hall the moment I entered. a glass of something expensive in his hand, and 3 centuries of inherited certainty in his spine. Rank 3, combat rating S. He was, I'll grant him, genuinely gifted. You could see the work in him, the thousands of hours. It's always the genuinely gifted ones who break hardest, because they've never once had cause to doubt that gifted was the same as strong. Everyone's very impressed with the man who killed a B-gate. I'd be impressed too if I believed it. B-gates don't die to one punch. So either the footage is doctored, or you're an unranked monster who got lucky against a wounded apex, and either way, you don't belong in this hall with people who earned their rank. He smiled for the cameras. Prove me wrong. Sanctioned duel. Here, now, first yield. Unless the miracle only works when no one's watching. The hall loved it. Cameras swung. Somewhere Halloran was calculating whether this helped or hurt his acquisition and deciding, wrongly, that a controlled demonstration of his asset might do nicely. Sloane was there, at the head table, the spear in a dress uniform, and she did a thing I noticed even then. She stood up, not to stop it, to see it. Humanity's strongest wanted a clean look at the answer to the question she'd been carrying since the yard. I looked at Dorian Vex and I was so tired. Not of him, of the whole tedious machine of it. The pride, the challenge, the certainty, the 1,000 years of things exactly like this that I had climbed through and hoped to have left at the top. But you always do it anyway. I don't want your rank, I told him, and I meant it as mercy. I don't want anything in this hall. I've spent longer than you can imagine wanting only one thing, and I already have her back. So walk away, Vex. There's no version of this where you look strong. There's only the version where I'm gentle and the version where I'm not. Coward, he said, and lunged. And it was fast, it was beautiful, an S-Rank's committed strike backed by the best training money could buy, a blur the whole hall gasped at. On the tower, it would have been a slow afternoon. I let it come, read it the way I'd read 10,000 deadlier things, and moved. One step inside his reach, the exact economy 1,000 years burns into you. And I set 2 fingers against his sternum and pushed. Not a punch. A push, the kind you'd use to close a heavy door, calibrated with the care I was learning to spend on a glass world. Dorian Vex, rank 3, left his feet, crossed 12 feet of gala floor and landed flat on his back beneath the very banner listing him as the 3rd strongest human alive, wheezing, unhurt, and finished, because a man whose whole identity is his rank does not survive the entire nation watching that rank get moved with 2 fingers and no follow-through. The hall didn't gasp this time. It went silent. The silence of 300 elite hunters revising, all at once, where the actual ceiling was, and realizing it had walked in wearing a borrowed suit and asking for nothing. I crouched by Dorian, the way I'd crouch to anything I'd put down and didn't hate. You trained hard, I told him, quietly, off camera, and I meant that as mercy too. In a fair world, that would have been enough. It's not your fault the world stopped being fair 15 years ago, and nobody told you what's really out there. I straightened. It's coming, by the way. What's really out there? You should spend less time defending your rank and more time surviving the thing that's going to make all of them meaningless. I didn't know how right I was. But across the hall, at the head table, Sloane Vega was looking at me with the silence gone out of her, and something far more dangerous in its place, recognition, and near the doors, Director Halloran was on his phone again, and this time he wasn't smiling, and the word I caught as I passed him, low and urgent, into the receiver was a word I hadn't heard anyone else on Earth say. Tell the choir, he murmured. The climber's real. Move the timeline up. The choir. He said it like a proper noun. He said it like something that had been waiting. I filed it, the way the tower taught me to file the sound of a floor's true predator before I could see it. And I walked out of that gilded hall into a night that it had just quietly stopped being about my sister's debt and started being about something with a name I didn't know yet. And a timeline. Someone had just moved up because of me. Sloane was waiting for me on the steps. Not officially, She'd left the head table, left the cameras, and stood in the cold in her dress uniform, with her arms crossed. Humanity's strongest, waiting for the anomaly like she had somewhere better to be and had chosen not to go there. You pulled that push, she said, no greeting. With Vex. You had him read in the first half second, and you spent the rest of it deciding how little to use. I've fought beside every S rank on this continent, and I've never seen anyone measure a strike that finely. She studied me. You keep doing that, catching the Guardian like a door, killing a B-boss with 100th of what you had. You're not just strong. You're strong enough that your entire problem's restraint in a world made of things that break. A pause. I know that problem. I've had it for 3 years. Mine's just 1,000 times smaller than yours, apparently. It's lonely, I said, before I decided to. That's the part nobody warns you about. Being the strongest thing in every room. You stop being able to lean on anything without breaking it. Something in her face shifted, the spear setting down her spear for a second. Yeah, she said quietly. It is. Then the professional came back up, but softer now, cracked open a hair. Whatever Halloran said in there at the end, I heard the choir. I've got good ears. I've been feeling the gates change for months. Deeper. Hungrier. Patterns the old data doesn't have. Everyone above me says I'm imagining it, because admitting it means admitting the ceiling might not hold. She met my eyes. You've been somewhere deeper than any gate. So I'm gonna ask you the question none of my superiors will let me ask out loud. Is something coming? Yes, I said. And I think you already knew, or you wouldn't have waited on cold steps to hear a dead man confirm it. She didn't flinch. That was the moment I started trusting her, I think, that she took the worst answer in the world and just nodded and filed it and squared her shoulders under it. Then I'd rather be standing next to the one person who isn't lying to me about it, she said. For what that's worth. Rank 1, at your service. Try not to make me feel like Vex. Wouldn't dream of it, I said. And for the first time since the door at the top of the tower opened, I didn't feel entirely alone on this side of it. The break came 9 days later, in the middle of the financial district, at rush hour, and I have never in 1,000 years seen worse timing, which was the first clue that it wasn't timing at all. A break is what happens when a gate isn't cleared or sealed in time, and simply tears its own mouth wide, vomiting its whole interior out into the world at once. This one opened at the base of a glass tower with 40,000 people in a square mile, and the monsters didn't trickle out. They flooded, a tide of them into the streets, into the lunch crowds, into a city that had built its entire 15-year peace on the belief that gates stayed put and hunters got there in time. I was across the city when the sirens went. So was every S rank, because I'd understand this later. That was the point. Someone had waited until the ceiling of human power was spread thin and then pulled the floor out under the softest, most crowded place they could find. By the time Sloane's car put us at the edge of it, the district was a killing floor. The 2 other S ranks were already in it, and they were losing. Not because they weren't strong, but because they were exactly as strong as the world thought its strongest could be. And the world had never planned for a break this size. One of them, the rank 2, was down, being dragged clear with his leg gone wrong. Dorian Vex was there, to his credit, fighting past his pride, holding a stairwell packed with civilians against a wave he couldn't turn. And I watched the exact second he understood he was going to die doing it, and chose to anyway, and I revised my opinion of him a little. The appraisal swept the tide as I walked into it, and painted it the color every shallow I'd waded through since floor 1. Threat, none. Threat, none. Threat, minor. And at the center, rising out of the torn gate, the break's apex. A thing the size of a building that would put this district in the ground, that Earth would rate beyond S. To me, it read like a mid-morning on a low floor. Bad if you were made of glass. Routine if you were made of 1,000 years. So I stopped being careful with the tide and careful with the apex, and I let the world see, for the first time, a fraction of what had come down the tower. I want to be honest about what that was, because the footage that survived doesn't capture it, and the survivors all describe it wrong. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even effort. It was housekeeping. I moved through the flood the way you'd move through a flooded room, turning off the sources, here and here and here. Every strike pulled to the exact weight that would end a monster without leveling the block behind it. 1,000 years of restraint spent all at once in the open. Where I walked, the tide stopped being a tide. The trick, the thing no one watching could have understood, was that the monsters were never the hard part. The hard part was the 40,000 people. On the tower, there had never been anyone to protect. Only me, only the climb. Here, every movement had to account for the bus full of office workers behind the creature I was killing, the child in the crosswalk, the old man frozen in a doorway, the fragile, soft, breakable human world stacked 3 deep behind every enemy. So I didn't fight the tide. I edited it. I put my body between the flood and an overturned commuter bus and let 24 leaping things break against my back rather than risk a strike that might carry through them into the glass. I caught a car that a fleeing monster had flipped, and her son like a lid. I threw a single monster the length of a street specifically, so the ones chasing a group of interns would turn and follow it instead. 1,000 years had made me a weapon. It took the 15 soft years I'd missed, stacked screaming in every window, to remind me what a weapon was actually for. And then I saw her, and for one white instant 1,000 years of composure deserted me. Nora. In the break. In an evac vest 2 sizes too big, herding a knot of civilians toward a side street with her cheap rookie barrier flickering over them. Because of course she was here. Of course the sister of the climber had run toward the worst disaster in the country instead of away. Because I had raised her, and she was exactly like me, and I had never once been able to decide whether that was my proudest or most terrifying achievement. A pack of the tide had gotten between her group and the cordon, cutting her off, and her barrier was already guttering. And she was doing the thing I'd done at the corner store 3 years and 1,000 years ago, putting her body in the doorway. I have never moved faster in my life, and I have moved fast enough to outrun my own death 10,000 times. I crossed the district. I put myself around her group like a wall, and the pack broke on my back, and Nora looked up at the giant shadow that had appeared over her, and instead of relief, had the gall to look annoyed. I had it, she panted. You had 4 seconds of barrier and 11 monsters. I had it for 4 seconds, she said, which is longer than most people would have, and I picked up her entire evac group's worth of danger and ended it around her mid-sentence, and she had the grace to shut up. But the fear had already done its work in me, cold and total. They knew who she was now. The whole world knew the climber had a little sister, and a thing that would tear a door onto 40,000 souls as a rehearsal would not hesitate to use the one lever that could move a man 1,000 years of the tower couldn't. I got her behind the cordon and made her swear to stay, which we both knew was a lie, and I went back into it with a new and specific terror riding me the rest of the fight. I reached Dorian's stairwell, and the wave breaking on it simply wasn't there anymore, and he stood in the sudden quiet, with his blade up and his mouth open, 40 civilians alive behind him, staring at the man he'd called a coward 9 days ago. Get them out, I told him. You held the door. That's the hardest job there is. I've got the rest. And I went to meet the thing the size of a building. Sloane came with me. That's the part I'll always remember about her, that when the strongest human alive saw the gap between us laid bare, saw exactly how little the apex meant to me and how much it would have cost her, she didn't freeze and she didn't defer. She fought. Beside me. Into a thing 3 ranks past what should have killed her, spear flashing, buying the civilians on the flanks the seconds I wasn't fast enough to buy them all myself, because even 1,000 years only gives you 2 hands. We fought together, and it worked the way almost nothing in my life has ever worked. Someone keeping pace at my shoulder, trusting me to hold the center while she held the edge. The apex was the size of a building, and it fought like one slow, tectonic, each swing folding a storefront, the kind of thing that wins by the sheer accounting of how much it can destroy before you wear it down. Earth had no answer for it. Earth's whole answer, all 3 S ranks and an army, was already broken on the streets behind me. So I gave it the answer the tower had spent 1,000 years teaching me. You do not outdestroy a thing like that. You get inside the space where its size stops mattering, and you end the small part of it that runs the big part. Sloane bought me that space. She read my intent without a word. Humanity's spear falling into the roll of the edge to my center like she'd trained for it her whole life, darting the apex's flank, drawing its tectonic attention, spearing the joints in the eyes, keeping the mountain looking the wrong way. I realized mid-fight, the first time in 1,000 years, anyone had fought with me instead of at me, and something in my chest that the tower had welded shut cracked a half-inch open at the sheer relief of not being alone in the center of a catastrophe. She saw it, though. I felt the moment she saw it. She put everything she had every year of being humanity's spear into a strike on the apex's flank, a blow that would have been the proudest kill of any other hunter's life, and it staggered the thing. And then I stepped into the opening she'd made, set my fist against the core of it, and finished what she'd started with a fraction of what I'd used on the doorman. And the difference between her, everything in my fraction was written in the air between the 2 blows for anyone with eyes. The apex came apart over the financial district, and the tide died with its source, and the district went from a killing floor to a graveyard to, slowly, a rescue, and I stood in the wreckage of the second worst disaster in the country's history and understood, from the way this stopped being a viral rumor and become something the world would now have to organize itself around, organize itself around, and savior to some, monster to others, asset to Halloran, all of it at once. Sloane stood next to me, breathing hard, blood not all hers, and she didn't say anything grand. She just said, that would have killed me. All 3 of us. Every hunter this country has. She looked at the dead apex, then at me. And you're not even winded. I'm winded, I said. Just not the way you mean. There's a kind of tired that isn't in the body. I looked at the rescue team starting to move into the ruin, at the survivors, at the enormous, soft, fragile city that had no idea how close it had come. 1,000 years of this, Sloane. That's the tired, not the fighting. The knowing you can't ever stop, because you're the only one who can, and if you sit down, the glass breaks. She was quiet a long moment. Then she reached over, humanity's strongest, deliberate about it, and gripped my forearm, the one gesture that could survive the gap between us, hunter to hunter. Then don't sit down alone, she said. That's the whole point of a team. You hold the center. I'll hold the edge. You're not the only one who can anymore. You've just been the only one for so long you forgot how to let someone stand next to you. 1,000 years, and no one had ever offered to stand next to me. I didn't have a word for what that did. So I just nodded and gripped her arm back carefully. And we stood in the wreckage together while the sirens came. It was Nora, of all people, who found the first proof it had been on purpose. She'd defied me and come to help the evacuation. Of course she had, and in the rubble at the break's origin, where no natural gate should have left anything but a scar, she found it and brought it to me with her hunter's instincts screaming. A ring of black iron sigils driven into the concrete around the gate's root. Not monster-made, man-made. An anchor. Something built to hold a gate open, to feed it, to force the break at a chosen hour, in a chosen place. And etched around the ring, the same word Halloran had breathed into his phone. A single sigil I would come to know far too well, the mark of the choir. The people who had opened a door onto 40,000 souls on purpose, as a rehearsal, and moved their timeline up the day a climber came home. I crouched over that ring of black iron for a long time, while the rescue lights swept the ruin behind me, and the cold that went through me had nothing to do with the fight. I knew this craft. Not the sigils, the intent. Deep in the tower, Past the floors where monsters merely hunt, there are floors where things worship it, where cults of climbers who broke on the way up learn to stop fighting the tower and start feeding it, opening the way for it in exchange for the scraps of power it drops to its faithful. I had killed my share of them on the way to the top. I had simply never imagined finding their handiwork down here at the bottom, on Earth. This wasn't a disaster, I said, and Sloane went still at the flatness in my voice, and Nora's hand found my sleeve. 40,000 people, and it was a test. They were measuring something. How wide they could tear a door. How fast the ceiling of this world would break. I stood, the black ring cold in my hand. The tower doesn't just take people, Sloane. Sometimes it recruits them. And someone down here has spent 15 years learning to sing its song, waiting to open something much bigger than a break. I looked up at the soft, bright, fragile skyline. They rehearsed on a district. The performance is going to be a city, and they moved it up because of me. They took Nora 4 days later, and they were clever about it, and clever is the only thing that has ever truly frightened me. Sloane and I had spent those 4 days pulling the thread, and it was Sloane who made it possible, because a dead man with no clearance can punch through a gate but not through a filing system. She used 20 years of rank and every favor she'd never once called in, and together we followed the black iron backward out of the rubble and into the paperwork. And the paperwork was so much worse than the monsters. The anchors led to a shell company, the shell company to a foundation with a serene name and a generous public face, the foundation to a list of donors, and the donors, this was the part that stopped me cold in a records office at 3 a.m, to the association itself, to Halloran. The choir wasn't a cult hiding from the authorities. It had grown up inside them, patient as rot, for the whole 15 years since the gates opened, because who better to arrange a citywide ritual than the men in charge of managing gates? They called themselves the Choir of the Ascendant. They believed the tower was a god descending, that Earth was the final floor, and that the humans who sang its door open would be spared, elevated, when it arrived. They had spent 15 years learning to feed it. The financial district break had been a scale test, and the main event needed a specific key. It needed me. Or, failing me, because I'd come home too strong to be handled, it needed the next best resonance the tower had ever tuned. My blood, which is a thing my sister and I share. That's why they took her. Not as a hostage to control me, as an ingredient. A climber's kin, blood keyed to the tower's frequency, is apparently exactly the tuning fork you need to force open the largest door ever attempted on Earth. Halloran had offered to erase her debt, upgrade her license, keep her safe, and every one of those offers had been a hand moving her closer to an altar. They grabbed her from a mandatory rookie safety briefing. The association had scheduled specifically to gather her. Of course they did. A form? A stamp. An official summons. My sister had no legal way to refuse. The same bureaucratic machine that had turned a funeral into a debt, and a debt into a hunter now turned a safety briefing into an abduction, and every step of it was signed and filed and perfectly in order. That was the choir's genius. They never had to break a single law. They'd spent 15 years becoming the law. When the alert reached me, Nora's tracker dark, her team drugged, that gray sigil on the wall, something happened in me that hadn't happened in a very long time, because on the tower, there had never been anyone left to lose. I had climbed 1,000 years on the memory of her face, and I had walked out and won her back and been home for a handful of soft, perfect days, and in that handful of days I had made her the single most valuable ingredient on Earth, simply by loving her out loud. The choir hadn't taken a hostage. They'd taken the one debt I would burn the world to pay. I had done this. My survival had painted the target on her. The guilt of that is a weight I still carry, and it is heavier than any floor. And under the guilt, cold and total and 1,000 years deep, was the other thing. The thing I'd kept on a chain since I walked out the door. Sloane found me in the ready room when the alert came through. Nora's tracker gone dark, her team drugged, a choir sigil left on the wall like a signature, and she has told me since that in 20 years of hunting, she has never seen anything move the way I moved for the door. She caught my arm, humanity's strongest, and she braced her whole body to slow me down for one sentence. "I'm coming with you," she said. "And Kane, whatever you've been holding back this whole time, to keep from breaking the world, wherever they've taken her, there's no world to break. Stop holding back." I looked at her, and for the first time since I walked out of the tower, I let her see the thing underneath the restraint, the thing 1,000 years and 10,000 deaths actually make when it stops being careful. "I know," I said. "I've just been afraid of what happens when I do." The ritual site was an abandoned cathedral of a building, an unfinished cathedral, actually. A megachurch a defunct developer had left half-built on the edge of the city, all raw concrete and rebar, reaching at a sky it never got to hold. The choir had made it theirs. Hundreds of them in gray, singing, actually singing, a low droning harmony that made the air taste of the tower, ringed around a ritual circle of the black iron, and at its center, a gate already cracking open, wider than any I'd seen on Earth, its edges the wrong color, its pressure a thing I recognized from very, very high up. And chained to the anchor stone at the heart of it, drugged but awake, furious, my mother's chin said even now, "Nora, I stopped being careful. I need you to understand what that meant, because I had been careful for so long it had become the whole shape of me. Careful on the tower, rationing myself against floors that punished waste. Careful in the yard, in the gate, in the gala, in the break. 1,000 years of a man holding a flood behind a wall of his own making, because the world on this side was made of glass and I could not stop seeing the windows. Restraint had stopped being something I did and become something I was. And in that half-built cathedral, with my sister chained to an altar and a door to the deep floors blooming over her head, I set the flood down. It is the most dangerous thing I know how to do, and the most honest, and I had been more frightened of it than of anything the tower ever showed me. Because 1,000 years of forging does not, and the only reason I was still a person and not a weapon was that I never, ever let all of it off the chain at once. I let it off now, for her, and the half-built cathedral learned what the tower had spent 1,000 years building. I want to describe it accurately, because the footage got out, and the world called it a massacre, and it wasn't. I didn't kill the choir. I have killed enough worshippers of that thing across 1,000 years, and I have never once found it made the tower quieter. What I did was take them apart from their weapons and their ritual and their certainty, all at once, faster than singing. I went through hundreds of them like wind through a wheat field, and where I passed, people were simply on the ground, disarmed, alive, their song broken in their throats. Here is the thing about 1,000 years of restraint that no one who saw the footage understood. Letting go of the chain is not the same as losing control. It is the opposite. When I finally spent what I had been hoarding, every fraction of it was still aimed. A surgeon's release, not a bomb's. I moved faster than the eye could follow, and I broke exactly what needed breaking and nothing else. The anchor staffs, the ritual foci, the gray-robed arms raising weapons, the certainty in 100 faces. A support pillar cracked where I passed it, and I caught the falling slab one-handed without breaking stride, and set it down over a cluster of fallen cultists so their own cathedral wouldn't finish them. Because even unchained, even furious, even 1,000 years deep, I would not let a soft breakable person die in front of me if a hand could stop it. Not even the ones who'd built the altar. The monsters were different. Their summoned floor guardians, the ones they'd bargained the tower for, the ones bred to eat the faithful's neighbors, those I killed, all of them, in the time it takes to cross a room, and I did not pull those blows. The cathedral rang like a struck bell with each one, and the surviving choir stopped singing and started screaming, and up on the ridgeline, where Sloan had staged the evac, hardened S-rank support hunters, who had seen every horror the gates could produce, stood frozen, watching a single man do to a summoning army what an army could not have done to a single gate. That was the footage that got out. That was the day the world stopped arguing about whether I was real and started, quietly, being afraid. Of the door in the cathedral, yes, but also a little. Of the thing standing between them and it. The choir's prophet stood at the ritual's head, an old man in gray with Halloran's foundation ring on his finger and the tower's madness in his eyes, and he did not run. He smiled at me, the way the deep floor cultists always smiled, the smile of a man who thinks the avalanche is on his side. Climber, he breathed, reverent. You of all souls should kneel. You've seen it. You know what's coming. The door is already open. You're too late to close it. And when the ascendant descends, only the choir will be. I didn't kill him either. I put him on the ground next to his ring and his certainty, and I went to my sister, and I broke the anchor chains with my hands, and Nora looked up at me, at the thing I'd let myself be, blood not mine to the elbow, the restraint finally off, and she did not flinch. My sister looked at the strongest and most frightening thing on earth, unleashed, standing over her, and she said, thick through the drug, "Took you long enough." Again. And I laughed. I actually laughed, in that terrible place, with the wrong-colored gate tearing open above us, because 1,000 years and 10,000 deaths, and the whole weight of what I'd just let myself become. And she still had the gall to give me grief for being late. That was the moment I knew they hadn't taken anything from her that mattered. The choir had wanted a tuning fork. They'd kidnapped a mercer instead. But the prophet, wheezing on the concrete, was right about one thing, and it curdled my laugh in the air. It was too late to close it. The door hadn't needed Nora's blood to open. It had needed her only to open it wider, faster, and my rampage through the ritual had bought her life at the cost of the last thing that might have slowed the summoning. The gate above the ritual circle was no longer cracking. It was blooming, vast, patient, wrong, and out of it, unhurried, came the first note of pressure I had climbed 1,000 years to escape, and had prayed I'd never feel on this side of the door. Something was coming through. Something that was not a floor guardian, and not a break-apex, and not anything Earth had a rank for. The Herald had heard the choir singing, and it had decided to answer in person. I got Nora and the prophet, both clear of the circle, carried my sister out under one arm, and dragged the old man by his collar. Because I wanted him alive to answer for Halloran, and for the 40,000 and for the altar he'd chained a girl to. And I handed them across to Sloane at the cathedral's shattered doors. Sloane took one look at the pressure boiling out of that gate and went the color of ash, because humanity's spear had spent her whole life measuring threats, and this one had no measurement. It was simply larger than the instrument. "Cain," she said. "What is that?" "On the tower," I said, watching the thing begin to fold itself down out of the door. Too many limbs, too much intention. A floor boss from a height this world had no business touching. They're called heralds. They come before the tower itself descends, to see if the floor is ready, to take a measurement. I set my sister down and made sure Sloane had her. It's not the tower. It's the knock on the door, and it just heard 15 years of these fools promising it a welcome. Behind us, the prophet started laughing through his broken teeth, blood and rapture. "It's here," he wept, joyful ruined. "The ascendant sees us. Director Halloran was right. The choir will be lifted." "Halloran's going to answer for this," I said, in a small gray room, from a witness chair, for the rest of a long and boring life. That's the punishment that would actually frighten him. I looked at Nora, safe, furious, alive, and at Sloane, who had one arm around my sister and her spear in the other hand, and no intention of running. And then I looked back at the Herald pulling itself fully into the world, over a city of 8 million soft, breakable, worth 1,000 years people. "Get her out of the city," I told Sloane. "Get everyone you can move, moving. Empty as much of it as you can in the time I buy you. And you?" I rolled my shoulders, and 1,000 years settled into them, and for the first time since I walked out of that door, I was almost glad to be the thing the tower had made. Because the thing the tower had made was, at last, standing between the door and the people it loved, which is the only thing it had ever wanted to be. Me? I said. I'm going to go answer the knock. The Herald finished pulling itself through the door, unfolded to its full height over the half-built cathedral, and I finally met something on Earth that made me spend more than a fraction. I want to be honest about that, because up to this point, the story has been a man wading through puddles, and you could be forgiven for thinking nothing on this side of the door could touch me. Something could. The Herald could. It came from a height on the tower I had bled centuries to reach, not the top, but high enough that when it turned its attention on me, the pressure alone cracked the concrete in a ring and put every unconscious cultist for 100 yards into a nosebleed sleep. For the first time since I walked out, the appraisal gave me a number that wasn't an insult. Threat, severe. High floor entity. Engage at full. Full. It had been 1,000 years since I'd had a reason to go to full, and I'd forgotten, a little, what I was when I did. The city's defenders arrived to a fight already beyond them. Sloane had the evac moving. She'd gotten Nora and tens of thousands of others flowing out of the blast radius. But the association scrambled everything it had left at the cathedral, because a thing that size on the skyline is not something you can hide from a city of 8 million. The remaining S rank, the military's gate response batteries, attack craft, Dorian Vex leading a strike wing with his pride finally burned down to something useful underneath. They hit the Herald with everything 15 years of human preparation had built. And they were magnificent, is the thing. I need that said, because of what came after. These were not cowards. The last standing S rank, a grim woman named Okafor, who ran the Northern District, walked her power into that thing's shadow and did not flinch. The gate response batteries. Weapons built over 15 years specifically to kill the largest threats a gate could produce, fired in a rolling barrage that turned the night white. Dorian's wing threaded the Herald's swings with a courage that had nothing left of the gala peacock in it. Every soul who fought the Herald that night fought like the last line of a species, because that is exactly what they were. It didn't notice. It didn't notice. That is the exact horror of the gap between the floors. Humanity's absolute maximum, its whole ceiling and arsenal, landed on the Herald like rain on a mountain. A missile barrage that could level a district guttered against its hide. Dorian's strike wing, S-rank talent, and courage, spent without stint, bought about 4 seconds of the Herald's attention and paid for those seconds in aircraft. I watched the strongest the world had to offer break against the knock on the door, and I understood, finally and completely, why the choir had knelt. If you did not know there was anything stronger, if you had never climbed, the only sane response to the Herald was worship. Good thing I'd climbed. Vex. I caught his falling craft out of the air, set it down, hauled him out of the cockpit by the collar. He was burned, half deaf, and still trying to get back up, which was the most I'd ever respected him. You held the door at the stairwell. You held it here. That's twice. It's enough. Get your people back and get them behind Sloane's line. I looked up at the Herald, at the Shing measuring my glass city with too many eyes. This floor's mine. You can't fight that, Dorian rasped, not sneering now, just a man watching another man walk toward his death. Nothing can fight that. Something can, I said. It's just been away for a while. And I went to full. I don't have good words for it, because the version of me that goes to full is a version I spend the rest of my time carefully not being. 1,000 years of forging, 10,000 deaths, every scrap of the restraint set down at once. Not the surgeon's release of the cathedral, but the whole flood, aimed at a single target that could actually take it. The air changed. The cracked concrete under my feet turned to powder and then to a crater, and I hit the Herald, the way I had never once allowed myself to hit anything on this soft, breakable earth, and for the first time since the yard. Something hit me back and I felt it. We fought. Actually fought, the thing I hadn't done in 1,000 years, a real exchange against a real threat, and some buried, terrible part of me that the tower had made was almost grateful for it, the way your lungs are grateful for air you didn't know you'd been starving for. The Herald was fast and vast and old, a high-floor apex that had ended climbers better than me, and the first exchange told me the truth of it. This would not be a doorman. This would not be a push with 2 fingers. This was the deep end, come looking for me, and it had found me on the wrong side of the door, where I had a city at my back instead of empty stone. It drove me through a building. I got up, because getting up is the one thing I am better at than anything else in creation. It is the entire skill the tower spent 1,000 years teaching, the only one that ever mattered. It caught me across the chest, with a limb like a falling bridge, and I felt ribs the tower had forged to withstand god floors actually give, and I paid it back for that. Drove my whole 1,000 years into the joint of it and heard something ancient crack. We traded like that, through the cathedral, through a parking structure, across the ruined face of a district, a high-floor herald, and the one climber who'd come down 2 things that did not belong on this earth, settling an argument the earth could not survive being near. It carved me. I bled, red this time, real, the first blood I'd shed on this side of the door. And I paid it back with interest, 1,000 years of interest, and the half-built cathedral and 3 blocks around it came apart under the exchange because there was no longer any way to be careful and also survive. That was the trap of it, and I saw the trap even as I fought. Full meant fast, and fast meant destructive, and destructive meant the city. Every second I spent at full trading blows with the Herald, the fight itself did damage a break would envy. I could kill it. I was slowly, terribly killing it. But I was killing my city to do it, and the Herald, this was the intelligence in it, the thing that made it a Herald, and not just a monster, knew that, and started aiming its bulk at the places where people still were. It wasn't trying to beat me. It had already taken its measurement. It was trying to make winning cost me everything I'd come home to save. And it was working. I put it through a tower, and the tower came down, and I had to break off, at full, to catch the debris before it reached the evac line. And in the half-second that cost me, the Herald turned, unhurried, toward the ridge where 100,000 people were still funneling out, where Sloane's spear was a bright, thin line, holding the panic together, where my sister was. I was fast. I have told you I am fast. 1,000 years, fast, faster than anything this world had ever clocked. But I was on the far side of a ruined district, holding the weight of a collapsing tower off an evac line, and the Herald was already at the ridge, and physics is physics even for a man the tower made. For one endless instant, the whole arithmetic of 1,000 years came down to a distance I was not going to close in time. It was the corner store again. It was 3 years and 1,000 years ago, exactly. To the inch, a door in the air, reaching for a girl with my mother's chin, and her brother a half-step too far to matter. I had thrown myself into a tower to win that half-step once. I had climbed 10,000 deaths to never lose it again. And here it was again, the same cruel gap. The Herald's bulk descending toward the ridge where 100,000 people ran, and one bright thin spear line held them together, and one furious girl in an evac vest was screaming my name back at me across the ruin. Not again. Not her. Not while this body still stood. Not if it cost me the last of the 1,000 years. Not if it cost me everything the tower ever forged. Nora. And humanity's spear stepped into the gap I couldn't close. Sloane Vega, who had spent 20 years being the strongest thing this world could make, who knew to the decimal exactly how far below a high-floor herald that put her, who had told me on cold steps that she'd rather not lying to her about what was coming, planted her feet on that ridge in front of 100,000 people, and my little sister, and threw every year of herself at a thing she could not beat. The half-tree. To buy the half-second I needed to arrive. Because that is what the edge does, so the center can hold. She had told me that too. I just hadn't understood, until that instant, that she'd meant she would die of it. Her spear hit the Herald in the one place 20 years of instinct told her was soft. An eye, a seam, the hollow under a limb, and it was the finest strike I have ever seen a human throw, and it did what a perfect strike from humanity's ceiling does to a high-floor apex. Almost nothing. A flinch. A quarter-second's hitch in the descending bulk. It was not enough to stop the Herald. It was exactly enough to let me arrive. I closed the half-second she bought me with the last of what 1,000 years had, and I caught the Herald's descending mass on my shoulders an arm's length. Above the ridge, above Sloane, above the evac line, above my sister. The whole weight of a high-floor entity bearing down and a single man under it refusing. On ruined legs, on cracked ribs, on 1,000 years of practice, at not staying down, to let it fall the last arm's length onto the people behind him. My feet went into the ridge to the knee. The stone screamed, and I held it. Sloane was down. Broken, I could see it, the wrongness in how she'd landed, the blood, but breathing, because the flinch her strike had cost her had also pulled the Herald's killing weight a few degrees off her, and a few degrees was the difference between a body and a corpse. Norga was already at her side, dragging her back from under my straining shadow, screaming at me the only word she had, which was my name, which was the same word she'd screamed at a corner store 1,000 years ago. Something in me went very quiet then, quieter than the deepest floor. I had spent 1,000 years learning that there is a place past rage, past fear, past even the will to survive. A cold, clear country where the only thing left is the arithmetic of what you will and will not allow. And I would not allow this. Not the ridge. Not Sloane. Not my sister screaming my name at a monster twice in 2 lifetimes. It ended here, on this ridge, tonight, whatever it cost, the district, the last of my strength, the body the tower spent 1,000 years forging. All of it was on the table, and none of it weighed anything against the people at my back. I set my feet. I got my hands under the Herald's mass. And I did the thing you are never supposed to do with an apex this size in a populated place, the thing 1,000 years had taught me was possible, and 1,000 years had taught me to fear. I lifted it, all of it, the whole descending mount in my head, and I turned, dragging its bulk away from the 100,000 and the girl, out toward the dead heart of the ruined district. Out toward the dead heart of the ruined district, where there was no one left to lose. Beat. You came to take a measurement, I told it, in the language of the deep floors, my voice steadier than my legs. Let me give you one to carry home. And I gathered up everything 1,000 years, and 10,000 deaths had made, held nothing back, kept nothing in reserve, spent the entire climb in a single held breath, and I began the last thing I had. There is a technique at the top of the tower that has no name, because the only people who reach the floors where you learn it are too changed by then to bother naming things. It is not a punch. It is the whole of a climb delivered at once, every death, every forging, every year of 1,000 years compressed into a single strike that the body can only survive throwing one time, because throwing it uses up the reserve that keeps the body standing. I had used it exactly twice in the tower. Both times I had died of it and let the tower rebuild me. Out here, there would be no rebuild. I threw it anyway. You always do it anyway. I put 1,000 years into the Herald's core, out in the dead heart of the ruined district. And for one white instant, the two of us, the knock on the door and the one climber who'd come down, were the only things in the world. Everything I was went into that strike. Not a fraction. Not a pulled push or a surgeon's release. The boy on the corner store steps. The 6 months that were 12 minutes. The fever that killed me. And the 400 deaths on floor 3 and the year 400 quiet I'd carved my sister's name against. And every one of the 10,306 times the tower ended me, and I refused to stay. And 1,000 years does not go quietly into one blow. It went screaming. The crater under me dropped another 20 feet. The night went white to the horizon. Windows a mile out that had somehow survived, the whole battle chose that moment to let go, all at once, a citywide chime of glass. And then the instant ended, and only one of us was left standing, and barely. The Herald came apart. Not like the doorman, not like the break apex, not like anything the footage had caught before. A high-floor entity unmaking, its wrong-colored mass sublimating into the night. Its too many eyes going dark one by one. The pressure that had cracked concrete for a mile lifted all at once, and the city, for the first time in hours, was only a city again. Broken, burning in places, but standing. With 8 million soft, breakable people in it who would wake up tomorrow not knowing how close the door had come. I did not come apart, but it was a near thing. I went down on one knee in the crater, and I stayed there. And for the first time since I walked out of the tower, I was actually, physically, all the way spent, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took me a moment to recognize it as the thing ordinary men feel every day and call being tired. My blood was on the stone. My hands wouldn't quite close. And it was, in its way, wonderful, because a man who can finally be emptied is a man who finally had something left to give. Nora reached me first. Of course she did. She half fell into the crater and got under my arm and hauled at a body. She couldn't move an inch, of furious weeping, calling me every name she'd invented in 3 years of grief, and I let her think she was helping me up, and I got up because she was pulling. The reckoning came with the dawn, and it was quieter than the battle and lasted much longer, which is how real reckonings go. Director Halloran did not get lifted by the Ascendant. He got lifted by a Crown investigative unit out of his own office on the strength of a Foundation's donor list, a prophet's testimony, and a black iron ring that matched the anchors under 40,000 graves. Because Sloan, even broken on a ridge, had made sure the evidence went somewhere he couldn't reach before the fight was even over. He spent his last morning of freedom explaining to men who did not worship anything that the tower was real and coming, and that he'd only wanted to be on the right side of it, and they wrote it all down for the psychiatric evaluation. And the man who dealt in leverage discovered, at the end, that he'd never held any. The choir came apart the way institutions of rot always do once the daylight gets in, all at once, and blaming each other. 15 years of patient infiltration, unmade in a week, because the one thing a conspiracy of the ambitious cannot survive is the discovery that the God they were selling everyone out to had arrived, and lost. Faith is a bad currency the moment the miracle dies on the skyline, and the world had watched the miracle die. That was the part no institution could manage or bury. The whole planet had seen the footage. Seen the batteries and the aircraft and the last S-ranks break against the Herald like surf. Seen a single scarred man lift a mountain off a ridge full of people and carry it away to die alone with it. There was no press release for that. The association spent weeks trying to write one and gave up. Some governments called me a weapon and tried to court me. Some called me a threat and quietly drew up plans they knew wouldn't work. Most people, the ordinary soft 8 million kind, just called me the one who carried it away from the ridge and left flowers absurdly at the edge of the crater, as if it were a shrine, as if I were dead, which I understood. Part of me had died out there, the part that could still throw 1,000 years in one blow, and it was not coming back. The city began to rebuild almost immediately, the way cities do, brick over the crater, and let me be a rumor its children argued about. I preferred that to the courting and the plans. A rumor gets left alone. Dorian Vex testified. Voluntarily. Against colleagues, against the rot in the association he'd spent his life climbing, in exchange for nothing. And when it was done, he found me in the hospital corridor and did not sneer and did not challenge, just stood there a moment. A proud man rebuilt smaller and truer and said, "You told me to spend less time defending my rank and more time surviving what's coming. I'd like to learn how. If the man who came down the tower is teaching." I told him to hold doors. He'd gotten good at it. He said he knew. Sloan lived. It was a near thing, and a long one. A high-floor herald had put humanity's spear through 3 buildings, and even the strongest human body is a human body. But she was too stubborn to die of buying a half-second, and I have some small skill learned in 1,000 years of surviving my own wounds at keeping a person on the living side of a bad night. I sat with her through it. When she finally surfaced, days later, thin and furious and alive, the first thing she did was assess me with those cataloging eyes and say, "You went to full." I felt it from the ridge. "You threw something that should have killed you." A pause. "You did that so 100,000 strangers and one wall guard's worth of sister could go home. And you," I said, "you stepped in front of a herald for a half second you knew you couldn't survive." "Edge holds so the center can hold," she said, like it was obvious, like it wasn't the bravest sentence I'd ever heard. And then humanity's strongest person, flat on her back and held together with more determination than bandage, reached over and took my hand. Carefully, the way you'd take the hand of something that could crush you. And had chosen 1,000 times not to, and neither of us said anything else. Because 1,000 years, and I had finally found the one person on this side of the door I couldn't break and didn't have to carry. That was worth more than the top of the tower. I'd know. I'd been to the top of the tower. The world didn't know what to do with me after. It still doesn't. Savior, monster, the unrankable thing that killed a god over the skyline. I let them argue. I registered because I'd said I would, under a classification they had to invent. Not a rank, but a note. Beyond scale. I walked Nora to school. She's studying to be the kind of hunter who gets everyone else home, which is the only rank I've ever been proud of. And I fixed the door I'd taken off its hinges, and I learned slowly, clumsily, gratefully, how to live in a world made of glass without breaking it. We got the soft years I'd bled 1,000 for. Not many of them, as it turned out, but real ones. I cooked our father's cheap noodles until my hands stopped being a threat to the bowls. Nora moved us somewhere with a real second bedroom and let me put my furniture out of the box at last. And never once said I told you so about keeping it, which was its own kind of love. Sloane healed slow and mended stubborn, and somewhere in the long weeks of her recovery, she stopped being humanity's spear at my kitchen table and started being just Sloane, who takes her coffee ruinously sweet and cheats at every card game and looks at me like a question she's decided. She likes not having answered yet. The three of us. A returned dead man, a rookie who wouldn't quit, and the strongest woman alive learning to sit still, became a strange, small family in a repaired apartment, and I would not trade 1 hour of it for the whole top of the tower. I want that on the record before the rest because the rest is a shadow, and I don't want the shadow to be the last thing. The last thing worth saying about the soft years is that they happened. That a man who spent 1,000 years alone in the dark got to come home and be loud and gentle and not alone. Whatever comes, that already happened. Nothing can unclimb it. But I didn't stop listening. A man who has spent 1,000 years hearing a floor's true predator before he can see, it doesn't get to stop listening, even at home, even happy. And on the quiet nights under everything, I can still hear it. The thing the herald came to measure. The reason the choir sang. Because a herald is only ever the knock, and the knock means the visitor is on its way. The interface the tower left in me, the one that reads everyone's pathetic little numbers, gave me its last update the night the herald died, and I have not told anyone what it said. Not Sloane, not Nora, because they've earned a few soft years first. It said, "Descent confirmed. Floor 1, Earth. Ascension begins. The tower is coming down. The whole of it. Every floor I climbed for 1,000 years is going to arrive, one at a time, on the world I bled to get back to. The herald was floor 0. The knock. I have thought about it every quiet night since, turning it over the way I once turned the marks on a wall. 1,000 floors, descending onto 8 billion people who think an S rank is the ceiling of what can exist. Everything I climbed past, the doormen, the guardians, the heralds, and the things far worse than heralds that live in the heights I try not to remember. All of it, coming here, to the corner store and the cheap noodles and the repaired apartment and the girl studying to get everyone home. The world has no idea. It buried its dead from the break in the Herald and told itself the worst was over, the way you do. The worst has not started. But here is the thing the tower never understood about me. The fight it lost in year 400 and kept losing every year after. It spent 1,000 years trying to make me into a weapon with no reason, and it failed. Because I always had a reason, and now I have more of them than I have ever had in my life. A sister who won't quit. A woman who steps into gaps she can't survive. A city that leaves flowers at a crater. 8 billion strangers who deserve to keep arguing about rumors in the sunlight. The tower made the strongest thing it could and then handed it every reason in the world to stand in a doorway. That was its last mistake, and it doesn't know it's made it yet. I climbed 1,000 years to come home. It looks like home is going to need me to climb again, except this time I won't be climbing away from the people I love. This time I'll be climbing in front of them. Let it come. I know the way up better than anything that has ever existed. And for the first time in 1,000 years, I won't be climbing alone.